So here's a really fascinating story about Seth Rogen. Now, Seth Rogen is a comedian. He's Jewish, which is what makes this story so interesting. He went on a podcast with a guy named Mark Maron, and it was talking about basically everything about being Jewish. I guess Seth Rogen grew up extremely Jewish, going to Jewish camps and all of that kind of stuff. And so he called Israel ridiculous, antiquated, and based on lies. And he also talked about how he's afraid to tell other Jews, other Jewish people. So I'm actually going to read to you all of these comments here because there are quite a bit of them here. So it says writer-comedian Seth Rogen was on the Mark Maron podcast yesterday promoting his new movie An American Pickle, which involves Jewish life in the U.S. Maron raised the idea of Jews moving to many places in the world after the Holocaust and not to Israel. Rogen agreed. I think that's a better strategy. You don't keep all your Jews in one basket. I don't understand why they did that. It makes no sense whatever. It would be nice to live somewhere that is not part of the Christian apocalyptic prophecy. Maybe live somewhere that the Christians don't think we all have to die. There's some common vested interest in the meantime. Our ridiculous visions are temporarily parallel and allied with one another. Maron asked, "Do you want to live in Israel?" Rogen exclaimed, "No." Maron says, "I'm the same way and we're going to piss off a bunch of Jews. For some reason my mother, who's not religious, her generation, they're kind of hung up on Israel and they find comfort in it. I couldn't imagine living here." Rogen says, "No, there are nice parts, but at best you are convincing yourself that you are far enough away from a major conflict to not worry about it, which is a terrible thing to convince yourself of. I don't understand. To me it just seems very like an antiquated thought process. Like, if it's for religious reasons, I don't agree with it because I think religion is silly. If it is truly for the preservation of Jewish people, it makes no sense. Because again, you don't keep something you're trying to preserve all in one place, especially when that place has proven to be pretty volatile. I'm trying to keep all these things safe. I'm going to put them in my blender and hope that's the best place. That will do it. It doesn't make sense to me." And I also think that as a Jewish person, like, I was fed a huge amount of lies about Israel my entire life. They never tell you that, oh, by the way, there were people there. They make it seem like it was just sitting there. Oh, the fucking door's open. Maron says, "Ours for the taking." Rogen then says, "Yeah, literally, they forget to include the fact to every young Jewish person. Basically, oh yeah, there were people living there." Then Maron says, "They want to make you feel frightened enough about your own survival that when you're old enough, you will make sure money goes to Israel. You always speak highly of it, and Israel must survive no matter what." Rogen says, "I don't understand it at all. I think for Jewish people, especially who view themselves as progressive, and who view themselves as analytical, and who view themselves as people who ask a lot of questions and really challenge the status quo, like, what are we doing?" Maron says, "I get frightened to talk about it, and we're afraid of Jews." Rogen then says, "I know I'm afraid of Jews. I'm 100% afraid of Jews. That's it. Aside from James Caan, we have no one to be afraid of. It's scary, but we're Jews. We can say whatever we want. If anyone can say whatever they fucking want about this shit, it should be two famous Jewish people. If anyone's getting rounded up first, it's our fucking asses. We are outwardly Jewish." And so that concludes all of the relevant comments from both Rogen and Mark Maron on this issue. So it's really, really interesting on multiple points here. And as he talks about, he's very outwardly Jewish, and this podcast, by the way, the context of this whole podcast was supposed to be basically talking about everything Jewish. That was basically the context of this podcast. It was supposed to be talking about the Jewish upbringing and all of Seth Rogen's experiences, and I guess Mark Maron's experiences. So that's sort of the context of this, but then I guess in the second half it took kind of an interesting turn here. But this is really interesting because not only, this seems like a pretty steep turn, and this article also makes mention of his signing of a letter defending Israel, basically pledging his support to Israel. Remember when Israel was bombing the shit out of innocent civilians in 2014 in the Gaza raid? He had signed on to it, so he's clearly made a pretty big shift in the past 6 years. I'm not sure what's responsible for that big shift. But he talks about multiple interesting points here, but I want to really remark about how fascinating it is that he's made such a big turn, because he's basically, to what he's saying is, he's not even interested in promoting, or doesn't even seem to believe in a reason to have an existence of Israel. He's kind of like going against that, which is like that's pretty far of a pivot and a turn, which is actually really really surprising to me. But he makes some interesting points, and so he mentions, by the way, that the evangelical Christians, the reason why they support Israel so much is because that's where I think that's where the Antichrist is going to come out, and all the Jews need to be there or whatever, and that is absolutely true, of course, totally. But what's interesting here is he talks about how he was fed a huge amount of lies about Israel his entire life, and how they didn't really tell him about any of the truth whatsoever. Now, this is really a fascinating thing that you guys may or may not have known. So in Israel, it's actually older voters who are lesser right wing and more towards the left. So it's the complete opposite. In the United States, it's the complete opposite, right? It's young people who are more liberal and more progressive. In Israel, it's the complete opposite. So as you can see from this graph, of voters 18 through 34 back in 08, 57.7% said that they were right wing. And you can see it went up 61.3. Now it's hit a peak in 2018 at 63.5% of 18 through 34, and then 35 plus is 46.7%. And actually, if you go and you look at Benny Gantz versus Benjamin Netanyahu, which Benny Gantz isn't like, he's not like some lefty or anything like that, but he is more to the center of Benjamin, although he's not like some sort of really lefty or anything like that by no stretch of the imagination. But as you can see, 65 plus, the oldest age group, 35% say they support Benjamin Netanyahu. So it's like a complete flip on the head, pretty much, compared to what exactly is going on in the United States. It's like it's the younger people, and so to me, I think when Seth Rogen talks about the lies that he was fed, I'm sure that and this is something that happens in a lot of different countries. I feel like Japan doesn't, I'm sure they don't teach their students about all the horrific crimes that Imperial Japan committed, which were pretty much on par with Nazi Germany. I'm sure that they're not really aware of that stuff. China's not too keen on teaching about the Tiananmen Square massacre. This is a common thing, right? And so Israel is going to, especially when you're talking about the vested interest is your survival of your nation. Obviously you're going to dictate the education in a way, and Benjamin Netanyahu really is nothing short of a fascist. To be quite clear, he's also the Israeli police have recommended he be, charged of bribery crimes. I don't know where that case went, but he did, I guess, win this election in a really, really split decision that was going on between himself and Benny Gantz. And so I think that that's what he's talking about there, is just the way that the education is set up, where it's like, oh yeah, they're not really mentioning Palestine, and they clearly dictate. And that's not something that's like, I want to be clear, that's not something that's unique, you know what I mean? Like, even U.S. school, we're not taught a lot of stuff that we should be either. So it's not like it's unique to Israel. It's just, in this specific case, it's just, conducive to this one. But yeah, and then he talks about how Jewish people who are progressive, in the United States, like, vast majority of Jewish people are liberal, man. They're liberal, but a lot of them are often they're either, liberal in terms of just American politics, or, they might even be liberal on Israel and more. They might be more, sympathetic towards the Palestinian cause, but they still believe in the right of Israel's existence and that it should exist. Seth Rogen here seems to be taking a complete slant where he's like, yeah, the whole existence of Israel altogether kind of doesn't make sense. And when you look at a map and you see how it's Israel surrounded by a bunch of Arab countries who it's not like they're all like perfectly in line either. They're always beefing with each other. There's all kinds of, Muslim on Muslim, violence, insane amounts, by the way. Obviously, you guys know Sunni versus Shia, huge wars, where one side says the other is not a true Muslim, not a real Muslim. So it's not like they're together either. But why would you plop a Jewish state right there? It just seems weird. And then you come into issues with the Jewish state as well, because the reason why they're denying the right of return to a lot of Palestinian refugees is because they don't want to get outnumbered in their own country. So at that point, you're talking about race controls for the purpose of not being outnumbered, which is just, I think John Kerry had said that you can either be a democracy or a Jewish state. You have to choose, because they're blocking people from coming in who, are Palestinian refugees because they don't want to get outnumbered in their own country. They don't want to get outvoted. So it's more of a ticking time bomb, to be honest with you, that it is. And so if you know the origins of this kind of conflict, or some of the origins, Palestine was basically made a British mandate after both World War One and World War Two. And so, it was under the control of Britain, and they were given the control over it, but then they handed it over to the UN. And so, Israel was basically able to be founded after, there was a lot of, obviously, after the horrible acts of the Holocaust. Obviously, it was a huge, huge reason why. But, what would end up going on is a lot of, Zionist terrorist groups would pressure Britain into, allowing them to make their state, like Irgun and a lot of those groups. So there was a lot of that was going on. And it just doesn't seem like a great idea to plop that state there. And I think obviously it's important to understand the horrific plight of Jewish people, especially after, during and, the times of World War II. I don't think we'll ever really truly be able to comprehend the unbelievable atrocities that occurred with 6 million Jewish people, being rounded up and burned. And it's really horrible. But I don't think that plopping that state there was a really good idea logistically, or really in any way, shape, or form. It's just seemed kind of ridiculous to me, just logistically speaking, even in the least. And so I guess that's where Seth Rogen is going now. If Seth Rogen was not Jewish, and if he wasn't like super Jewish, like he's, like I said, he's really outward about it. This whole podcast was about his Jewish experience. He would probably not be comfortable sharing this, but I think because he is Jewish, I think that gives him a certain leeway. We all know about Ilhan Omar and how, she caused a lot of, controversy. And again, it goes to show you that right now, if you say anything that's not in line directly with Israel, you're an anti-Semite. And so that's another thing that needs to change. But this is a really interesting story for sure. And he's, again, like I said, he's made a big turn here. He signed on to that 2014, declaration of support for Israel when they were doing their bomb raids in 2014 in Gaza. So, really interesting stuff here from Seth Rogen. Definitely let me know your thoughts. This definitely seems like a bombshell story to me.